Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on opportunities for Louisiana in the Infrastructure and Investment Jobs Act. My name is Faith Garbett, and I work on the team at the PCARD Group. Please note your microphone will be muted for the entirety of this webinar. After the presentation, we will use the remaining time for Q&A. As you have questions, please submit them through the Q&A feature located at the bottom of your screen. We will be tracking submitted questions as we go. We are also recording this webinar, which we'll share with all registered participants in a follow-up email. I will now hand it off to Barry Erwin, President and CEO of CABL, who will be moderating the webinar. Thank you, Barry.
All right, thanks, Faith, and thank you all for joining us today as we discuss some of the opportunities for Louisiana in the Infrastructure, Investment, and Jobs Act. As Faith said, my name is Barry Erwin. I'm President and CEO of the Council for a Better Louisiana, or CABL. And again, we're glad to have you here with us today. This webinar is hosted and sponsored by the PCARD Group, a governmental affairs firm located in Louisiana and in Washington, D.C. CABL and the PCARD Group partner up throughout the year to share information to Louisiana citizens regarding various key federal and state topics. And this is another one of those, and we're really glad to be involved in participating in that. I'm glad you're with us. Here to join us today and give us a lot of information and insight is Emily Bacque DaSilva, who is a partner with the PCARD Group. Emily is a former U.S. Senate staffer and since 2005 has worked closely with local and state governments on various issues, including infrastructure needs. She brings an incredible wealth of knowledge, experience, and depth on federal appropriations and budget practices. Also joining us is Hunter Hall, who is also a partner with the PCARD Group. Hunter's background includes the U.S. Senate and U.S. Secretary of Commerce. He provides valuable insight into the many functions of the congressional and executive governmental processes and functions. And both Emily and Hunter are based in Washington, D.C. They've got a great presentation for us, a lot of really good information. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to them to get us started.
Well, thanks, Barry. Hunter and I are going to, discuss the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act for you all today. It's a huge bill, and so we're not going to get through everything. We're really focused on kind of new programs that you may not be familiar with, but I'll kick it off. It's approximately $1 trillion. It was signed into law on November 15th. The White House has put out estimates for all of the states, and they're saying Louisiana should receive around $4 billion over the life of the bill. It is a 5-year bill, so it starts with fiscal year 2022 and will run through fiscal year 2026. What's interesting about this bill is that it's a traditional surface transportation reauthorization bill combined with guaranteed appropriations. So for those of you who are familiar with surface transportation law, you may be familiar with the FAST Act, which was the previous 5-year bill. A piece of this is $475 billion, which is the surface transportation side of things. Then on top of that is appropriations for additional Department of Transportation programs. And then on top of that is other appropriations for the Department of Energy, Department of Commerce to address broadband, EPA for water infrastructure, resilience, et cetera. So it really is just a very complex and large bill. As I mentioned, there are 5 years to get the money out the door. Agencies do, however, have their work cut out for them. In statute, it says for a number of these new programs that agencies have about 180 days from enactment to stand up the new program. So that's May 14th, 2022. Again, as I mentioned, it includes $475 billion on the surface transportation reauthorization side. I'm flagging this because it's a 50% plus increase over FAST Act levels. So off the bat, Louisiana can expect a 30% increase in highway formula funds than what we were receiving under FAST Act levels. As I mentioned before, it creates entirely new formula and discretionary grant programs. And so again, we're really going to focus on new programs, but don't forget fan favorites on the discretionary side, like RAISE, which you may know is Tiger or Build because they keep changing the names, and ENFRA. Again, agencies are releasing requests right now for information, so RFIs, to solicit input on programs on a rolling basis. And I know that we have already sent out dates that the Department of Transportation put out regarding various briefings that they are holding by mode. And then I guess, one interesting tidbit, which I'm sure many of you have seen, is that Mitch Landrieu, former mayor of New Orleans, was appointed the infrastructure czar. And so the White House is basically putting together a task force to deal with this tremendous amount of funding that will start to flow. He is heading it up, and then various agencies will have staff detailed to his office. I'll now kick it over to Hunter Hall, who will give kind of high levels on transportation spending and others such as Department of Energy and broadband.
Thank you, Emily. So, as Emily said, there's $1 trillion that's going to be coming down with this new plan, and it's broken up. We've broken it into several buckets we'll go through right now, high level, before we get into some details later on. The first one, roads and bridges. It's $110 billion that'll fund new dedicated grant programs to replace and repair bridges, while also increasing funding for the major competitive grant programs like infra and race. Also, in the $110 billion for roads and bridges, that will maintain a 90-10 cost share, 90-10 split, federal and state. The next bucket is passenger rail, $66 billion for Amtrak National Network for new service and dedicated funding to the Northeast Corridor. This increases funding for freight rail and safety. 36 billion of these funds, of the 66, will go towards an expanded scope of projects eligible for federal-state partnership beyond Amtrak and state-owned assets. This allows for the expansion of or construction on new intercity passenger rail routes. Next, we have transit, $39 billion. These funds are going to go towards repairing the nation's transit system backlog, which DOT estimates is around 24,000 buses, around 5,000 rail cars, 200 stations, thousands of miles of tracks and signals and power systems. This will expand transit systems, support clean transit options, and increase accessibility for seniors and persons with disabilities. Louisiana is expected to receive about $470 million over the life of this bill, over the 5 years. For airports, you're looking at $25 billion. This increases the funds for airport improvement grant program for runways, gates, taxiways. This also provides additional funding for airport terminal improvement program for terminals, concessions, multimodal connections. This also will go towards air traffic control infrastructure. Breaking out the $25 billion, you'll have about $15 billion for airport infrastructure grants, $5 billion for terminals, and $5 billion for facilities and equipment. Next is the ports and waterways. This is funding for waterway and coastal infrastructure, for inland waterway improvements, port infrastructure, land ports of entry through the Army Corps of Engineers, through DOT, Coast Guard, General Services Administration, and Homeland Security. This is $17 billion, and $2.3 billion of which is going to go towards the Port Infrastructure Development Program. Transportation safety. This will focus on highway and pedestrian safety programs, as well as pipeline safety and repair. You're looking at about $11 billion spread through a number of programs. Next, we've got low emissions buses and ferries. This is $7.5 billion broken into two buckets. It's $5 billion for replacing existing school buses with the zero emission and clean school buses. Some of these funds will be prioritized towards low-income rural and tribal schools. The last portion of these funds is $2.5 billion for the replacement of existing ferries with low-carbon ferries and to assist states with the operational costs for these essential rural ferries. Next up, EV charging stations. That's $7.5 billion. That'll build out the first ever national network of electric vehicle chargers in the U.S. and hopefully accelerate the adoption of electric vehicles to support domestic manufacturing jobs. The goal of this is to facilitate long distance travel and provide convenient charging options. There will be a particular focus on rural, disadvantaged, and hard to reach communities. This is high level. We'll break out the $7.5 billion for EV charging station into their appropriate buckets later on. We also have $1 billion for reconnecting communities. And these funds are going to go towards projects that will remove barriers to opportunity caused by legacy infrastructure. The program is going to provide dedicated funding for planning, design, demolition, and reconstruction of streetlights, of parks, and other city infrastructure. Next slide, please. Now we're looking at broadband, water, energy, environment, et cetera. So, water, first off, $55 billion. $23 billion of this is going to go towards drinking water and wastewater infrastructure, with another $15 billion towards lead service line replacement, and $10 billion for PFAS. There's also $3.5 billion for water infrastructure through the Indian Health Service Sanitation Facilities Construction Program focused on tribal communities. Broadband, this is a big one. A number of municipalities in Louisiana are very interested in this. You're looking at $65 billion in grants to states for broadband deployment, looking to expand broadband access and make it more affordable for low-income families. It expands eligible private activity bond projects to include broadband infrastructure, and it'll support middle mile deployment efforts. One of the last buckets here, energy and power. We're looking at $73 billion for grid reliability and resiliency, and support for a grid development authority. This will include support for critical minerals and supply chains focused on clean energy technology, as well as carbon capture, hydrogen, direct air capture, energy efficiency, and other demonstration projects. Environmental remediation is looking to address legacy pollution. These are funds that will help clean up brownfield and Superfund sites, reclaim abandoned mine lands, plug orphan oil and gas wells, all in an attempt to create good paying jobs and improve public health. Finally, we've got $46 billion for resiliency, and this is cybersecurity related, looking to address critical infrastructure needs, waste management, flood and wildfire mitigation, drought, coastal resiliency, ecosystem restoration, heat stress, and weatherization. It's rather broad, but obviously an area where Louisiana could benefit significantly. And now I'll throw it back over to Emily, who's going to discuss broadband and dive in a little deeper on several other opportunities.
Thanks, Hunter. So if we look at broadband, as Hunter mentioned, there's $65 billion available for broadband. The largest pot of that 65 is $42.5 billion, which will flow to states to fund broadband network deployments, prioritizing areas currently lacking a network capable of offering basically high-speed internet. This is on top of the American Rescue Plan's $10 billion program for broadband capital projects. And that bill also made broadband projects eligible for expenditures as part of the $350 billion appropriation to state and local government. So all that to say that broadband deployment has received a lot of money in this calendar year through various bills that have moved in Congress. Again, the bulk of this funding will flow directly to the states. And of course, Louisiana has stood up the Office of Broadband and Connectivity. So they will be the office that will kind of push out the funding. And of course, in the coming months, the Commerce Department, which houses the National Telecom and Information Administration, or NTIA, they will be convening a number of virtual listening sessions and other outreach activities to discuss the key broadband program provisions in the IIJA. So if you do have interest in the broadband provisions, I would say stay tuned as we learn more from NTIA as they start molding the guidance for that funding. There's also $1 billion, as Hunter mentioned, for the creation of the Enabling Middle Mile Broadband Infrastructure Program. And the purpose of this grant program is to expand and extend middle mile infrastructure to reduce the cost of connecting unserved and underserved areas to the internet backbone. And so middle mile, of course, is the network infrastructure that basically connects the last mile, i.e. local networks, to high-speed network service providers. There's also $2 billion that's going to the USDA's Rural Utility Service, Distance Learning, Telemedicine, and Broadband program. So on the rural side, USDA could be an avenue there. And then Hunter mentioned subsidies. There is $14.2 billion that will go to an FCC program that's currently known as the Emergency Broadband Benefit. And low-income qualifying households currently receive a $10 a month subsidy for the purchase of broadband service. This is now known as the Affordable Connectivity Fund, and it will be increased to a $30 per month subsidy to qualifying households. Next slide, please. So now we turn to water. And of course, there's $55 billion in total spending. The majority of that funding will flow through the state revolving funds. And EPA put out state estimates just last week for fiscal year 2022. And EPA says that Louisiana should receive around $101 million just in fiscal year 2022. It's basically split up between the safe drinking water and clean water for communities. So there's $15 billion that will go to lead service line replacement through the drinking water state revolving funds. 49% of those funds will be provided to communities as grants or principal forgiveness loans. 51% of those funds will be available to communities for low interest loans. There is not a requirement for a state match, so that's a big deal. And then the $11.7 billion will go to drinking water state revolving funds. Again, 49% of those funds will be provided to communities as grants or principal forgiveness loans. 51% of funds will be available to communities for low interest loans, and the state match is reduced to 10%. On the clean water side of things, the clean water state revolving funds will also receive $11.7 billion, and they have the same split. 49% of funds will be available for grants or principal forgiveness loans, and then 51% of funds will be available for low interest loans. Again, state match is reduced to 10%. So again, you're likely familiar with the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund and the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. Again, it goes from EPA to the states, and then from there, it will flow to locals. I'll now turn it over to Hunter, who can focus on the DOT formula programs.
Thank you, Emily. I'll go over the formula plans right now. We're going to focus on Federal Highway Administration before Emily gets into the new DOT discretionary programs. One of the first new DOT formula programs is the Carbon Reduction Program. This is $6.4 billion over 5 years for a new formula program aimed at reducing transportation emissions. These funds can be used for any surface transportation block grant program eligible use if a state can demonstrate a reduction in transportation emissions. The formula funds are provided to each state based on their share of the overall base apportionment, which means this formula takes into account how much each state pays into the Highway Trust Fund versus how much they receive. Of those funds, 65% are suballocated to areas within the state by population. Example of eligible projects include traffic monitoring, management and control facilities, public transportation projects, bicycle and pedestrian facilities, port congestion reduction, and efficient street lighting and traffic control devices. Next is the National Electric Vehicle Formula Program. Of the $7.5 billion for electric vehicle charging stations that we discussed earlier, $5 billion will be distributed via formula to states. Louisiana is expected to receive about $74 million per year. But before the distribution can happen, DOT has 90 days from the date of enactment to first develop guidance on how and where states and municipalities will actually deploy the electric vehicle charging infrastructure. This program for distributing the $5 billion in electric vehicle charging infrastructure formula funding must be created within 1 year of the date of enactment. This means these funds likely won't be distributed until later in 2022. Next up, the Bridge Formula Program. While the Bridge Investment Program is not new, the formula funding distribution method, which will be used to administer a majority of the bridge funds, is new. This new formula piece is going to allocate $27.5 billion to states to support bridge replacement, rehab, preservation, protection, and construction. The minimum each state will receive each year is $45 million, with the $27.5 billion being spread out over the 5 years. Finally, when it comes to new formula funding programs within DOT, the Promoting Resilient Operations for Transformative, Efficient, and Cost-Saving Transportation. They're calling it PROTECT. This is $7.3 billion to help states improve the resiliency of transportation infrastructure with both formula and competitive grant distributions. Eligible projects include storm surge and flood protection related to highway projects, public transportation facilities, intercity rail facilities or service, and port facilities. The resilience grants will be made up of resilience improvement grants, community resilience and evacuation route grants, and at-risk coastal infrastructure grants. The Fed shares 80%. Other federal funds may be used for the other 20%. These funds can be used to create a resilience improvement plan. And if the state or MPO has developed a resilience improvement plan and prioritized that project from the plan, then the federal cost share will increase 7% to 87% with that resilience improvement plan. And again, the funding over 5 years by formula will be $7.3 billion. Now to dive into several new DOT discretionary programs from the Office of the Secretary, from Federal Highway, and from FTA. I'll throw it back over to Emily.
Thanks, Hunter. So first up, one of the new big programs in the Office of the Secretary is the National Infrastructure Project Assistance Program. It's $15 billion, of course, over 5 years, up to 60% federal share. And it can be used for both planning and construction. When you think about who's eligible, it's pretty much anyone, state and local governments, ports, transit agencies, et cetera. It's to support freight-related projects, including roads and bridges, intermodal facilities, grade separation or elimination, intercity passenger rail, public transportation, or a combination of these. 50% of the funding is for projects between 100 million and 500 million. 50% is for projects over 500 million. I want to reiterate that. That's huge. When you think about the Department of Transportation and you think about kind of the existing grant programs, there really hasn't been much there for these large infrastructure projects. This program will now get at that. And, you know, honestly, I should mention this as well, even though they're not new, I mentioned it earlier, raised grants will receive $15 billion over 5 years. Again, this is a huge increase. Usually they only receive around $1 billion annually. And I'm sure a number of our local governments who are on here have submitted raised grant applications in previous years. You all know how oversubscribed this program is. So the thought is, with more money there and with, you know, funding for this new National Infrastructure Project Assistance Program, you know, there's hope that there will be more opportunities for you to receive these funds. I should also state that the infra program, again, for, you know, really large infrastructure projects, will receive $8 billion as well. So again, these are 3 programs for big projects. Next up is Safe Streets and Roads for All, $6 billion. Basically, it's to focus on the development and implementation of Vision Zero, which is to eliminate all traffic fatalities and serious injuries. And there's 25 million, so it seems kind of small, again, for states and local governments for stopping threats on pedestrians. You can think of areas with large groups of pedestrians, you know, and the idea of installing bollards, et cetera, to prevent threats to them. There's a new program called the SMART program, Strengthening Mobility and Revolutionizing Transportation. There's $1 billion there. Again, it's competitive and it builds upon the success of the Smart Cities Challenge that some of you may have heard of previously, to conduct demonstration projects focused on advanced smart city or community technologies and systems in a variety of communities to improve transportation efficiency and safety. Now, you know, switching gears to FTA, there are a couple programs here we wanted to highlight. I know Hunter talked a little bit about Ferries earlier. I know there are a couple communities in Louisiana that do use ferries. There's $1.75 billion that could go towards low emission ferries. Then there's a railroad crossing elimination program. There's $5.5 billion for this program. The minimum award size is $1 million, except for planning grants, and the federal share is 80%. It's a new competitive grant program for highway rail or pathway rail grade crossing improvement projects that focus on improving the safety and mobility of people and goods. Eligible projects include grade separation, track relocation, improvement or installation of protective features, other safety projects, a group of any of the projects I just mentioned, and planning and design of eligible projects. Now, next slide, please. Switching gears to federal highways. Again, there are a number of new discretionary programs here as well. First off is the active transportation infrastructure investment. It comes out to $200 million a year for a total of $1 billion. It establishes competitive connectivity grants that will invest in projects that connect active transportation infrastructure, accelerating local and regional plans to create safe, convenient walking and biking routes to everyday destinations. So think of connecting public transportation to businesses, workplaces, schools, et cetera. 30% must go to projects that construct active transportation spines. And $3 million a year will be set aside for just planning and design grants. On the charging and fueling infrastructure grants, again, Hunter talked about formula funds that will go to charging and fueling infrastructure, but there's also a new competitive grant program, $2.5 billion, to strategically deploy publicly accessible electric vehicle charging infrastructure and hydrogen fueling infrastructure and natural gas fueling infrastructure along designed alternative fuel corridors or in certain other locations that will be accessible to all drivers. Again, this is open to local governments to apply. There are going to be community grants as well. So half of the funds are required to be reserved for community grants for projects expected to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to expand or fill gaps in access to alternative fueling, including development phase activities and acquisition and installation of infrastructure, with priority given to rural areas and low and moderate income neighborhoods and communities with a low ratio of private parking spaces to households or a high ratio of multi-unit dwellings to single family homes. Now, I know one of the big ones that Louisiana has been focused on is funding for bridges. Hunter already talked about the formula side. There is a brand new competitive bridge grant program, and that totals $15.8 billion to encourage bridge repair that will improve safety, efficiency, and reliability of people and freight movement. And it does leverage non-federal contributions, and it allows for bridge bundling and culvert work as well. Large projects, so 100 million or more, grants will be 50 million or greater, but not more than 50% of the project cost and may be carried out through a multi-year agreement. Small project grants will be a minimum of 2.5 million, but not more than 80% of the project cost. Now moving on to congestion relief program, there's $250 million included for this new program to provide discretionary grants to advance innovative, integrated, and multimodal solutions to congestion relief in the most congested metropolitan areas. Now, I know when we think of metropolitan areas, we think of places with populations of 1 million or more, which again, there's really no place in Louisiana that would meet that criteria. However, just so you know, states are eligible to obligate funds in urbanized areas under 1 million in population. Then also the Healthy Streets program, there's $500 million included to provide grants to eligible entities to deploy cool pavements and porous pavements and to expand tree cover. The goals of this program are to mitigate urban heat islands, improve air quality, and reduce the extent of impervious surfaces, stormwater runoff, and flood risks, and heat impacts to infrastructure and road users. And then Reconnecting Communities pilot program. Again, Hunter touched on this a little earlier, but this establishes a new pilot to study the feasibility and impacts of removing an existing transportation facility, such as a highway that creates a barrier to community activity including mobility, access, economic development, and design factors such as high speeds or grade separations. And I know that when President Biden was first talking about his infrastructure plan, oftentimes New Orleans and the Treme neighborhood was highlighted and was used as an example with I-10 kind of cutting off the Claiborne neighborhood. Funds can be used to conduct studies, planning, and construction. Planning grants can be awarded up to $2 million per recipient and federal share of 80%. Again, it can go to local governments to perform the necessary planning functions. And then it also allows for technical assistance to build organizational or community capacity for planning and innovative solution development. It gives priority consideration to communities that are economically disadvantaged. Reducing truck emissions at port facilities. There's $400 million for this program for testing, evaluation, and deployment of projects that will reduce port-related emissions from idling trucks. And then the Rural Surface Transportation Grant Program. There's $2 billion included in this to improve and expand the surface transportation infrastructure in rural areas. And rural is defined as an area outside an urbanized area with a population of over 200,000. The goals of this program are to increase connectivity, improve safety and reliability of people and freight movement, generate economic growth, and improve quality of life. Funds can be used for development phase activities, construction, reconstruction, rehabilitation, and more. And the minimum grant size is $25 million with a federal share up to 80%. And there are certain project categories that qualify for 100% federal share. So I know we've thrown a lot at you. There are so many new grant programs. We didn't even hit all of them today, but wanted to give you a flavor. As we mentioned previously, and I'll just reiterate, Department of Transportation and these other agencies that have jurisdiction over implementation are slowly starting to, hold webinars and put out guidance. And so I think, early into 2022, we'll begin to learn more about these various programs. And now I'll turn it over to Barry.
Well, thanks so much. I mean, that was a lot of information, a lot of really great information that I know a lot of us haven't been able to see in that kind of depth and in that kind of quality. So thanks to both of you. Certainly, if any of our participants have some questions, we would love to hear from you. We want to try and get those questions answered while we're here. I do have a couple of things that are on my mind and maybe are on the minds of some of our other folks here too. I'll just start by asking again, tell us again how much money we expect to get here in Louisiana, and also when do we expect to maybe begin to see it flowing here that we can actually get our hands on some of that?
Sure. Hunter, I'll take a stab at this and then please jump in. Right now, the White House, I mentioned earlier, is estimating that Louisiana could receive as much as $4 billion over the life of the bill. It's tough to say exactly how much, though, because some of it is formula and then some is going to be competitive. And so, we can say that already we're going to see a 30% jump in formula funds related to highways. But as far as competitive, it's up to us to apply and to have strong applications. In terms of timing of when it will flow, it depends. EPA just announced last week funding would flow quite soon on the clean water and drinking water side of things. So I think if the state hasn't received kind of that first tranche yet, we will be soon in like the next week or so. And as far as DOT on the apportionment side for FY22 for highways, we should see that rather soon in terms of that jump. On the competitive side, again, we will wait until those roll out. I imagine the bulk of those will roll out by May, as we mentioned. And then, of course, there will be timing to apply for those grants. So my guess is probably late next year, we'll start to see some of those competitive grants awards start to flow.
Thanks, Hunter. Anything else to add on that?
No, I just think, there's a lot of folks that we've spoken to that are very concerned with the timing. I think Emily covered it. We're happy to answer any questions. A lot of this is still, we're waiting on DOT, Department of Energy, EPA to come out with guidance and come out with the actually standing up the programs that will distribute these funds. And so I think it's just a wait and see kind of situation on many of these programs right now.
Let me ask you something too. You talked on a lot of these projects about matches. I mean, I assumed from what I heard you say, different programs have different matches. Some maybe even get full federal funding or eligible for that. Do we know roughly though for the major infrastructure, the type of things we're talking about here, roads, bridges, that type of thing? Is there a sort of a standard match that the state needs to meet, or is that going to differ by these many buckets of programs that are out there?
It's a great question. I think in general, it's going to differ, but you've often heard, and for those who are kind of in the transportation world, kind of the 80-20 split, which I think is kind of the most traditional. I have found that oftentimes if you can provide an overmatch on the local side, which I know is not ideal, but if you can provide kind of over what the minimum is, that usually kind of gets you a cut above in terms of the competition. So that may be something to think about, is trying to find kind of that local match. But I think, Barry, to your point, it's probably going to depend on each specific grant program, and we'll have to wait on that guidance to come out.
Sure. Well, I know
added to that.
Go ahead.
Sorry, Barry. Go ahead. Well, I was going to say, added to that, obviously there was a significant amount of funding that came down to municipalities at the beginning of the year with the American Rescue Plan. Well, we have cautioned each of our the municipalities that we've spoken to is don't use that to pay for, don't use your 20, 30, $40 million to pay for a $4 million project and an $8 million project and a $2 million project. Those funds for many of these programs can be used as the match to a federal, to an opportunity here. And so you can multiply the free dollars that came down with the American Rescue Plan can be multiplied into, if you get $20 million, you can turn that into 80, 90, and 100 million if those funds are used properly. And that would be my recommendation to any local government, is before sending the money from American Rescue Plan out the door, look at some of these opportunities and let's see if you can get 3 or 4 or 5 times the amount of money that you were actually received from the rescue plan.
One thing with us here in Louisiana, I guess really it's everywhere, but we do have the huge backlog that we've talked about for so many years. And I guess one piece of that is because we know we have this backlog and we sort of prepare for it, we do have a lot of projects that are somewhat shovel ready to go if we can get them funded. Is that any particular advantage for us that we do have some things, that are ready to go if we can just get some of the dollars to do that?
I think it certainly helps. I mean, it's funny, and I'm glad you brought up shovel ready, because when you think of the previous stimulus under the Obama administration, and I believe it was 2009, there was a real focus on shovel ready and getting money out the door and getting people working. This, again, is not a one-year deal. It's over 5 years. So they don't necessarily need to be shovel ready. But Barry, to your point, we have projects that are ready to go. And so I think that helps us in the planning and as we're prioritizing. So we don't have to do like as much on the planning side of things. We can say, okay, we have 5 or 6 ready to go, and they may fit into X or Y bucket. So I think it does help that we do have such a backlog and can start to focus on various grants that may help us.
Can you touch a little bit more too on coastal opportunities? Certainly we have plenty of those opportunities for us, but in terms of the funding, how does that fit into that for us with coastal opportunities?
Well, Hunter talked about it in his presentation. I think one of the biggest kind of buckets is this resilience and protect program. It's both on the formula side and the competitive side. So there will be plenty of money there. I would also add that even kind of outside of this particular, massive bill, one of the focuses of this administration is resilience. And so I think kind of across the board, you will see priority focusing on projects that do just what we need to do, which is, resilience of our coastal line and kind of planning for climate change type projects. Hunter, I don't know if you have anything to add there on protect.
No, I think you covered it.
Let me hit on something else too. I mean, you mentioned drinking water. That's certainly a big concern, especially in recent years here in Louisiana. A lot of those issues happen in small communities or rural areas where, they're just really overwhelmed by the issue and the dollar amounts there. You talked a little bit about the processes, I think, with the revolving program. Is that something that the local governments, the communities themselves are going to have to take a lead on, or can they really work with the state on those to try and get that? I know it's a big deal a lot of times for these small communities to try and have to get in these big grant programs and try and compete for those types of dollars. How is that going to work for them? Are they going to be in a position to be able to take advantage of some of these revenues?
They should be. And again, they will have to work with the state office, but I imagine the state is preparing, with both the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund and then the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. I know the state does work with various municipalities to come up with kind of the state priority plan and what projects fit on that. So I think there should certainly be some outreach kind of from the state to these local folks and vice versa. Hunter, I feel like, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I feel like you may have worked on this with one local government in particular, and it's just getting them in touch with the right folks at the state.
I think that's right. The Clean Water Revolving Fund, the State Clean Water Revolving Fund, it's just about finding the appropriate contact, developing that relationship, educating them on your project, understanding the process, what is needed on their end, what's their coordination responsibilities, what are their responsibilities to EPA or to the coordinating federal government entity. And I think just asking those questions can really provide a lot of answers and help make the funding for your project a little bit easier to attain.
One of the other things you mentioned was cyber, and I'm just kind of asking this as kind of a little shot in the dark, but I know a lot of our friends in North Louisiana, there's the cyber corridor there. We do a lot in that area, Shreveport, Louisiana Tech, and that type of thing. Is some of this revenue something that those kind of folks could take advantage of in the research piece, or are we talking really about other kinds of infrastructure that maybe don't fit in that? And maybe you may not know, but I know our North Louisiana folks would be very curious anytime they hear about opportunities on the cyber side.
It's a little bit of both, and this goes back to the resiliency piece. Cybersecurity, protecting that grid infrastructure. A lot of these funds will be for floods and wildfires, protecting the infrastructure against these major weather events, these natural disasters, improving resiliency along the coast, where some of our port infrastructure requires cybersecurity, has some cybersecurity needs. I think it covers a little bit above what you brought up, but the cybersecurity issues, especially in North Louisiana with some of the floods that have happened in the Monroe area, Ouachita Parish, I think these funds will go towards protecting and securing those the physical assets as well as some of the tech cyber needs.
Another issue that you touched on, which I think is close to the hearts of some people around here anyway, you mentioned rail, and there's certainly been a lot of talk over the years about rail between Baton Rouge and New Orleans and looking for opportunities there. I'm assuming that some of these dollars you talked about with rail, give us opportunities perhaps to pursue further?
I think that's exactly right. We talked about some of the funding the passenger rail. There was the funding that would go towards the federal state partnerships that expand the opportunities beyond Amtrak and state-owned assets. There's $36 billion that could potentially go towards renovating the tracks there between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, and creating a public-private partnership that would allow for that passenger rail service. I think there's several buckets in here for the research planning dollars, for the actual construction of new stations, and then the renovation of the tracks there as well.
And I want to say that state federal partnership program that Hunter mentioned, I want to say it's an 80% increase over current levels. So there's going to be huge amounts of money in that. And so to your point, Barry, there may be, ability to access some of that.
Well, that's interesting. And I certainly know there's a lot of interest there. Let me ask you, Senator Cassidy was here not too long ago talking up the infrastructure legislation quite a bit. he seemed to indicate that Louisiana, largely because of his participation in the negotiating of that whole bill and that process, was in a particularly good situation to be very competitive on of some of these things, and in fact, that certain things might be even tailored to some degree to put us in a really good position to access some dollars. Is that y'all's take on it too? What's your assessment on that?
I would say short answer, yes. Anytime you're at the table, you're able to help build the language in a way, you help tailor the language. And I think when you look at the 46 billion in resiliency we discussed earlier for cybersecurity infrastructure, I think when you look at the way some of the broadband funds are going to be distributed, and then looking at the passenger rail here and expanding that scope beyond just Amtrak and a state-owned asset, allowing you to work with other rail companies and existing rail, renovating that rail, having someone at the table advocating for broadening these programs and tailoring it to coastal resiliency, tailoring it to the cyber needs and port infrastructure, given how important the Port of Lake Charles is down there in the energy corridor. Yes, I absolutely believe that him being at the table allowed for many of these programs to benefit Louisiana more than they probably would have if he wasn't.
Yeah, I'll just reiterate that. Absolutely. And one of the programs we didn't even touch on was Army Corps of Engineers, because it's not new. But they pumped a whole lot of money into Army Corps, and there are some specific language in there basically saying to help, with those Army Corps assets that were impacted by natural disasters. So, you think of the hurricanes that hit Southwest Louisiana, that funding was really, I think, included in there to help some of those guys down there.
It's kind of ironic, I guess, but I mean, here we are, kind of a small state, but it just seems like when we're talking about infrastructure, we talk about roads and bridges, of course, but we just touched on rail, which is one thing. We've got these resiliency issues, these coastal issues, these flooding issues, these ports. I mean, there's really, it seems like a lot of potential for this to make a difference for us in our state.
There absolutely is. I think we have to get our mindset, though, around the fact that we will have to compete.
Right.
And so sometimes that can be daunting, right? Like sometimes you need to find a grant writer, and you really need to put a lot of time and sometimes money into those grant applications in order for them to be successful. And so again, it's not just going to come to you through formula, although some will, but a lot of this we will have to compete for. And so we just need to be prepared for that.
Yeah, on that point, I just wonder, is there any advice you have for the state, for our local communities? There's so much of this federal money that's already flowing in, for these other purposes. And some of that goes into, as you said, kind of an overlap into broadband, some other opportunities, not with these dollars, but with dollars we've already received. I mean, any advice or any thoughts for even groups like ours that are keeping an eye on things and want to, help with policies to make sure that we're, as well positioned as we can be to move on these dollars?
I think the one thing I would say, I'll reiterate something that I said earlier: optimizing the dollars that you received from the American Rescue Plan. Communities received anywhere from 7 to New Orleans got maybe $280 million. I can't stress enough the flexibility in those funds and in optimizing those funds in a way that allows you to multiply them. If you receive $10 million and you go after several, $10 to $20 million projects, you could spread the 10 million to $2 million match for 5 projects, and you've got anywhere from 30, 40 to $80 million worth of projects funded just from money that you didn't have to lift a finger to grab, and you didn't have to pull out of a savings account of some kind. You didn't have to go get bonded. I cannot stress enough being intelligent with the dollars from earlier in the year, and optimizing those for your community.
And I would just add, Barry, I mean, you said it earlier, we already have lists of projects, right? Like we already have ideas of what our priorities should be. So I would say really start trying to match those priorities with some of these grant programs. And of course, we don't know, there are a lot of these grant programs we still need to learn more about, and we still need to see the guidance from the agencies. But I think if you can start kind of in your mind, starting to connect priority projects with certain grant programs, I think that'll help you in the long run, because oftentimes you don't have a whole lot of time to put together these applications, maybe 60 days or 90 days. So start thinking
And
about
sorry, Emily, I would add to that, most city engineers, municipal engineers, and local governments know where the needs are. They know what the project is. They've got a rough estimate of how much it would cost. Well, now it's about diving into the details and as Emily said, actually putting a project, understanding where you can get planning and design dollars from, and then where you get the actual construction from, where you can get operation and maintenance funds from. And I think it's being very diligent, walking through your projects and being ready, so that when the opportunity is available, you've got everything down on paper, ready to hand off to whoever's filling out the application. I think also you look at opportunities like community project funding next year, which was kind of an earmark program brought back by appropriations. That's another opportunity to get a couple of dollars that could go towards some of these projects, or that could be separate. But I think you just have to be planning, and you have to be ready with each of your priority projects, so that you're not caught off guard with only 60 days to compile all of the information necessary on a $25 million road project.
We got a question here from one of our participants I wanted to pass on to y'all. It says, with disaster recovery being such a huge need across many communities of the state, and CDBG being very underwhelming and very housing focused, do you anticipate the political appetite for more CDBG DR for Louisiana being reduced due to the influx of all this new money? So I guess, do we see the addition of these dollars maybe hurting us on the other end with CDBG money or that type of thing?
I don't. I mean, it's totally separate. And so I think, these infrastructure dollars that we're talking about have nothing to do with HUD or CDBG in this infrastructure bill. We'll see what happens with Build Back Better, which is kind of the second piece that may pass early next year, I believe. And there is some HUD components there. But on the CDBG DR front, I mean, I know just from working with various folks in the state, and then of course with our senators and House delegation, they are really pushing for additional funding for CDBG DR, and just trying to make the case, and the governor is as well, to make the case, to the appropriators that we need additional funding. And so I think there is potential talk of another supplemental bill coming early next year. But I could be wrong, but I don't think kind of these infrastructure dollars will impact that discussion.
Let me ask you one other thing. You talked about at the very beginning, the fact that Mitch Landrieu is going to be over this in some capacity. I don't know if y'all have had a chance to cross paths with Mitch or anything yet on that, but how significant do you think that is in the scheme of things for us?
I think that it could not have played out better for Louisiana. He understands our needs, not just in New Orleans, where he was obviously mayor for a long time, and where his family is from. But I think he understands the needs of municipalities across the state and country because of his role in the national mayors groups. And I think his experience with natural disasters, with some of the infrastructure issues in Louisiana, such as both of the I-10 bridges. I really don't think that could have played out any better for the state. I think it's a matter of just having those conversations, and again, being prepared with all of the data and the necessary information and required.
Well, it's just interesting. It does seem like when you, again, look at all these projects that we have, the fact that we have so much infrastructure given our small state, and Mitch, I don't know, it's just funny. It seems sort of like we are about as positioned as we could have hoped for if we can make sure we get our act together and do the things that we need to do to take advantage of it. I think we had another question from one of the participants that Faith has for us. Faith, can you take care of that one?
Yes, and I think this will probably be our last question as we're getting towards the end of the webinar. In regard to the American Rescue Act funds, matching other funds, the participants said they were informed back in September via the Southwest Louisiana Recovery Fund that those dollars could only be used for expenditures for July 1st, 2021 to June 30th, 2022, and then an extension would take legislative action. Are you aware of a change that allows those American Rescue Act funds to be used past the deadline, or is it possibly Southwest Louisiana Recovery Fund has that restriction?
Go ahead, Emily.
It could be that the Southwest Recovery Fund has that restriction. I would honestly, to really get an answer to this person, we would need to know which ARP funds they're talking about, because there were so many different kind of deadlines on the various pots. But I think for most of the fiscal relief, the local and state fiscal relief, I believe you had well beyond June of 2022.
December 23 or December 24 to
Yeah.
utilize those funds. It was going to come in two tranches, the first half of which was received in the spring, early summer of this year, and the second half will be received in the spring, summer of this coming year. And you have, I want to say it's December of 2023 or 4 to expend those dollars.
That's right. And so they may not be talking about that specific pot, the 350 billion, but happy to communicate with them offline.
Okay, great. Thanks. And we are right towards the end, close to 11 o'clock. So that's going to bring us to the end of today's webinar. We want to thank Barry for moderating our session, and thank you, Emily and Hunter, for the informative presentation. And thank you to all the participants for joining us and submitting questions. We will be sharing the video and other materials from today's webinar in a follow-up email, and they will also be accessible on our website, thepcardgroup.com. Thank you so much, everybody, for participating.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Barry.